The cassette arrived on a rain-slick Tuesday, the envelope sweating in my hands and smelling faintly of stale ozone and printer ink, the return address a blank rectangle of white where someone had scrubbed a name. If you will stay with me until the end, I promise you details no mainstream file has published and a recording that changes everything. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I grew up on stories of missions and quiet funerals. My uncle was a telemetry technician at a facility people now call a whisper, and the sound of tape reels and metal racks is an old comfort I have in my chest. Inside the envelope was a plastic case, the yellowed sticker on it scuffed, and a single note folded 3 times. Play at midnight. Do not record. Trust no official statement. I put the cassette into my player, and the room seemed to shrink around the humming motor and the soft hiss like snow. The voice that came through was thin with age and coated in the rasp of long tobacco and something like regret. "If you are hearing this, you were not supposed to," the speaker said. The promise was a razor, a mission no one in public knows, a survivor called Eva James, and instructions that read like rules for surviving a ghost. There were lines underlined on that scrap of paper. Do not call your contacts at work. Do not upload the tape. Bring only one person to meet the man in Glendale. If you find a photograph, burn it after you see it. If you hear voices inside your head, walk into open light. Before I tell you the rest, pause now and tell me in the comments whether you believe in missions erased from history. The tape clicked, and I set my beer down and followed the voice into a story I had not planned to inherit. The cassette began by naming a date and a small, almost mundane launch site that does not exist on the blueprints the public sees. Apollo 20 was a salvage mission, the voice said. It was not on the schedule. I signed the clearance. My name is Richard Holloway. I put Eva on life support. Those words made the air in my apartment taste metallic and thin. I could hear the neighbor's radiator breathe through the wall and the tape deck's motor as if both were living witnesses. I decided then that whatever this was, I would follow it back to its source, no matter the risk. The recording offered a partial transcript of events, and then cut to a second voice, female, with a cadence like a compass needle finding north. "We found something that was not a rock," she said. "It had eyes and a catalog number." The cassette carried static, as if the original had been recorded in a hangar with storms on the horizon. That was the activation point. I took the cassette to a cafe that night and watched the milk steam in a metal pitcher while I transcribed the first 15 minutes into a notebook as if I could trap the tape in ink. I found phrases that did not sit well with the official files that say only that Apollo missions ended and that the records are complete. The tape named names that do not appear in those files, and it introduced a single woman with a name that keeps surfacing in rumor boards and late-night forums, Eva James. The way the recording treated her made my throat go dry. "They kept her in a case," Holloway said. "She breathed, but did not wake like the rest of us might wake. She sang to the equipment." Listening to that line in a coffee shop where the grind of beans and soft conversations felt obscene and intimate at once. The voice left a trace of cigarette and diesel and the memory of hospital antiseptic so strong I could taste bleach on the back of my tongue. I walked out into the fog and decided to start at the edges. Public records, obituaries, any mention of an Apollo 20 clearance or a catalog card that might have been missed. The first rule the tape dictated was simple and stern. Never ask about Eva where they can hear you. The second was stranger. Find Dr. Marcus Hale at Glendale Memorial and do not mention the number 20 in his presence. The third was a promise, maybe a threat. If you go looking for her, you will take pieces of her with you, whether you mean to or not. Those rules became the map I could not ignore. I worked nights for a week poring over FOA returns and microfilm in a library that smelled of dust and varnished wood, the lamplight warm against my knuckles. I traced funding lines that evaporated, bank transfers with coded memos, and a short list of names that surfaced again and again. Marcus Hale, Lena Ortiz, Captain Ron Whitaker, Dr. May Sun, Thomas Keller, Anita Reyes, Victor Dumont, and Sarah Klein. Each of them had a small footprint in public documents and a larger shadow in the pages I could not access. I recorded conversations in my notebook with the scratch of my pen, and the creak of my chair felt as loud as a gavel. One of the tapes contained a list of instructions described as protocols for reawakening, and there were lines that read like Baroque prayer. Lights warm, then cold, pheromone neutralizers, vocalist recordings in a specific key. The procedural notes were clinical. They spelled out how to transfer life support, how to isolate neural feedback, and how to monitor a subject that resists being cataloged. The protocol description reads here like a small manual in a world where no such manual should exist. I sat in the public library with the hum of fluorescent lights and an empty late lunch tray and felt the weight of the archive pressing on me. At night, I moved to cafes and to a small park bench under a sodium streetlight, where pigeons shuffled and the smell of hot wires rose from the grate. The people around me were anonymous, and their anonymity felt like armor. I followed leads to a municipal archive whose clerk, Thomas Keller, wore a cardigan patched at the elbows and had the smell of paper and lemon oil about him. He pointed me to a box labeled with a cataloging error and said, "No one should be digging here." He told me about an early entry that was later crossed out and signed again by an unfamiliar name. His hands trembled when he handed me a photocopy. I pressed his comment into my tape recorder, and I felt the taste of fear, the metallic tang of coffee left to go cold. Thomas mentioned a name I had not expected, Dr. May Sun, who once worked at a research facility near the desert and later vanished from the public record. I took public buses through neighborhoods where neon signs blinked and the air smelled like frying oil, and in the small hours I would sit in the back of an almost silent reading room and transcribe what little I could. The investigation followed rules I did not invent. Meet people in public spaces, never tell more than necessary, bring nothing that can be copied. Lena Ortiz, a retired engineer from Pasadena, met me in a bookshop that smelled of dust and lemon and leather. They called it salvage, but it was more a recovery of something that should not be cataloged, she said. I signed my name to equipment lists, and I will not take that back. But when I saw what was inside, I understood why orders are the way they are. She had photographs, but when I asked to see them, she set her palm on mine and said, "No, look, but do not photograph. It stays on paper." The city at night was a chorus of distant sirens and soft pedestrian steps, and every sound seemed to mark a moment where someone else might be listening. As I collected fragments, I began to write down the rules I found repeated in whispers. Do not bring children. Do not let the subject into sunlight for more than 90 seconds in the first phase. Always have a musician present. Burn certain documents after reading. Those rules sounded ritual and laboratory at the same time. I met Victor Dumont at an outdoor market where spices from 3 continents mixed in the humid air. He handed me a cassette worn at the edges and said, "This one is dangerous." I kept it because I could not throw something like that away. His fingers left the scent of cardamom on my table. Anita Reyes, who used to run logistics at a facility in the desert, told me in a parking lot with the smell of gasoline hanging. They wrote her as Eva J. in the ledger. They gave her a catalog number, and then they wrote across it, "Not for circulation." The name Eva James turned from rumor into an outline. I kept hearing the same tight instructions. Find Marcus Hale, but do not say the number 20. That instruction felt like a key and a lock at once. The first time I saw Marcus Hale, he was older than his photograph suggested, a small man with a worn jacket and the scent of hospital soap. We met in a small diner whose vinyl seats had the sticky warmth of a city that does not sleep. He had tea, and the light from the window cut across his cheekbones. The scene had an array of senses pressed close: the clatter of silverware, the bitter steam of tea, the faint chemical tang of disinfectant, the light glazed by a thin film of rain, and the throaty, low noise the subject made when first weaned from deep sedation. The dialogue between us unfolded like a thread. I asked, "What was her condition when you found her?" He answered, "She was pale and breathing, and the electromyography showed patterns that were not in our databases." I said, "Was she human?" He said, "Some parts were. Some parts were catalogued as unknown." I said, "Why keep her?" He said, "Because someone wanted to study what should not be studied. Because someone wanted to make a claim they could not make in clear light." I said, "Who is responsible now?" He said, "Names change, institutions persist." I said, "Did you ever see her awake?" He said, "Once. She looked at me, and the light in the room was wrong." I said, "Wrong how?" He said, "As if the light did not belong to our planet." I said, "Did you ever hear her speak?" He said, "She hummed, but the vocalization did not align with language." We know, and yet we understood where she came from by the way she used frequencies. I said, "What about the life support?" He said, "It was an apparatus that learned to mimic heart rhythms. It could be tuned, and it could fail." I said, "Did the rest of the world ever know?" He said, "They were told stories about decommissioning. The rest was sealed." I said, "Who sealed it?" He said, "People who fear what we do not have names for." By the time the exchanges numbered a dozen, my hands had gone cold and the cup of tea had gone lukewarm. Marcus agreed to show me one photograph under the condition that I keep it in my memory and do not capture it. His eyes pleaded, as if knowing he was about to pass a secret on that might cost him something larger than embarrassment. He placed the picture on the table, and it was grainy and small, and yet it emanated the hush of something ancient and mechanical. The features were soft and foreign, and there was a catalog tag tucked in the corner with the code EVJ 1979. He said, "She was listed as a recovered airway anomaly, and then as an artifact. The ledger calls her a sample." The conversation turned into a long, exacting sequence where Marcus narrated events that read sometimes like a report and at other times like confession. The scene was full of sensory notes: the tea steam that curled into the light, the taste of grease from the diner fries, the coarse texture of the photograph under my thumb, the metallic tick of an old clock on the wall, the waxy smell of a newspaper page folded near his elbow. The meeting ended with the kind of quiet that suggested plans forming and danger retracted into shadows. With Marcus's name on my list, I began to press on institutional lines harder. I filed official requests and waded through false leads, and I met a retired captain named Ron Whitaker who had flown cargo runs for an agency whose trucks carried sealed crates into remote hangars. He had the smell of motor oil and rope on him, and his hands were broad and calloused. He told stories of midnight loads and unmarked manifests, and he laughed when he realized I had the same cassette he had heard in his car years before as a younger man. "We moved things that were not meant to be public," he said, "boxes with foam and a cassette in a pocket, men with orders and no names." He gave me a small schematic that looked like a shipping crate plan with cutouts and straps for life support systems, and a notation in a handwriting that looped and then stabbed. The document was procedural and clinical for part of it, and oddly reverent for another. The descriptions moved from boxes and straps to breath phase adjustments and the use of musician recordings to stabilize the subject. That technique is known as vocal entrainment in some parts of the archive, and the notes were detailed for a reason. A procedure note read like this, 3 separate times across documents: warm light at first, then blue notch, and then silence. That sentence alone carried the chill of another language. The deeper I pushed, the tighter the circle seemed to close around me. I found a technical memo that laid out a process for establishing neural feedback loops, and it read in a way that only the clinical voice could carry. Implant interface in occipital region using sterile saline medium, route sensory input through attenuators, monitor spikes at 60 Hz, employ music at 432 Hz for entrainment. The procedure required 9 discrete steps, including stabilization of the auditory cortex and 3 phases of life support transfer. That passage gives a sense of the technology and the careful cruelty of trying to remake an organism into evidence. The memo was 320 characters long in each of its core paragraphs and kept repeating specific phrases like life support interface and neural containment. The technical detail sat in the narrative like a small cold bone. I arranged to meet Dr. Mi-sun at a coastal bar where the wind carried salt and the air tasted of algae and old wood varnish. The place smelled of seaweed and fried fish, and a lemon wedge slid across my tongue when I sampled the drink she ordered. Mi had a deliberate calm and the irritation of someone whose life had been pulled sideways by orders she once obeyed. We spoke in a booth with cheap leather that squeaked when one moved, and the neon sign outside cast thin blue light across the table. There were regulations, she said. They wrote rules to make our hands legal, but rules do not make a thing moral. I asked about the protocols, and she answered in a voice with the precise register of someone trained in lab procedure. She outlined a containment protocol that included steps I later found in archived memos. She told me about the night they moved Ava and the smell of sodium and sealed plastic. She described the dull click of the door and the way the case hummed like an instrument waiting for a song. At one point, she leaned forward and whispered instructions that were later echoed on the original cassette. If you attempt to revive the subject, never do so alone. Always have an auditory stabilizer present and ensure a musician can modulate frequency on demand. Keep the subject away from sunlight until you understand its reaction. I asked, why sun? And she said, the subject had photic responses that were not human. Under broad daylight, certain neural firings occurred that interfered with the containment algorithms. I asked her whether this was ethical, and she paused, and the booth felt like a courtroom. We thought we were learning, she said, but you learn quickly that some things you can restore, and some things you cannot put back together. That conversation was long, and it contained more than a dozen exchanges between us that read like the depositions of people who have seen too much. We spoke of music and frequencies, and the smell of formaldehyde, and the taste of salt from tears that touched the lip of truth. After weeks of indirect contact and secret exchanges, I arranged a meeting with an informant who had worked intimately with the subject. His name was Victor Dumont, and he lived like a man who collects shadows in a small house lined with shelves and the smell of cedar. Victor had been a technician, and he had kept a small trunk of artifacts after the formal seals closed. He agreed to talk because he said he could not sleep. We met in his kitchen, the light low and the coffee rich and dark, the floorboards moaning when he moved. He pulled out a notebook with schematics and a USB drive that contained one degraded recording. I plugged the drive into a machine with the clack of a fan and a light blinking like a pulse. Victor's voice was brittle and precise. He told me about the first time the subject hummed on its own. The case light turned a certain cool blue, and the room smelled of hot metal, he said. The waveform did not match any catalog. It was something that recognized pattern in us more than we recognized it. We spoke, and the conversation between us stretched out in a pattern of questions and careful answers that totaled more than a dozen direct exchanges. Did she know you? I asked. He said, once she focused on my hand the way a child focuses on a toy. I asked, was she dangerous? He said, she was not malicious. She had a perception that was not ours, and that frightened people. I asked, what happened during experiments? He said, we played tones and recorded reactions. Sometimes the room would change temperature, and sometimes men would cry for reasons they could not explain. I asked, were you ever afraid for your life? He said, yes, because curiosity can kill, and because institutions will choose to close things down rather than explain them. Those exchanges grew into a clutch of confessions that felt like a small choir of guilt and lingering love. Victor gave me a schematic of a containment case and a recording of a voice that made no human language and yet communicated memory like a tide. The sound in the recording made the hairs on my arms stand up, and it left a metallic taste in my mouth. With Victor's materials and Marcus's photograph and May's protocol notes, I felt the orbit of the story tighten toward a center where a decision was inevitable. At that center, there was a choice made years earlier by men and women who were tired, by committees that feared scandal, and by technicians who wanted to learn. The central revelation built slow, and then, when the informant who had given me the cassette agreed to show me a sealed crate in a remote storage facility, it hit like a door closed in the dark. The crate was rectangular and lined with foam, and a small observation port of thick, transparent material fogged with breath. The smell at the facility was industrial, a blend of oil and cold metal, and a faint chemical that reminded me of dental offices. The lights buzzed overhead, and the concrete throbbed faintly beneath my boots. Victor had fingers that tipped with grease, and his breath fogged as he opened the case. Inside, there was a form curled in a case, pale and small like someone sleeping. The suit covering the form was pocked and stitched. When the case opened, there was a sound like a sigh, and I felt my stomach drop. The sensory details rushed like water. The smell of sealed plastic and iron, the sticky warmth of my palms pressed against cold metal, the smell of the oil on Victor's jacket, the sterile sheen of the observation port in the corridor light, the taste of dust in my mouth. The subject's eyelids were translucent, and when they opened, there was a geometry to the gaze that made my teeth ache. Someone had placed a tag that read EVA 1979 nearly under her shoulder, and the tag looked absurdly bureaucratic against the sweep of something that looked almost like a living being. The informant set up a small field monitor and began a protocol. The steps were exact and clinical, and I will not recreate them all in full detail, but the procedure required precise timing, the use of audio stimuli at a specific frequency, and an arrangement of lights that moved from warm orange to cold blue in measured intervals. We followed the protocol as if following a script written by people who had feared being judged. At first, the monitor showed hums of neural activity that resembled sleep. Then, there was a spontaneous rise in spikes. The lights faltered. The subject made a sound that was not a human cry, and yet it carried the cadence of mourning. At that moment, an emotion rose in me like nausea, the kind that carries the faint metallic taste and a ringing behind the ear. The session did not go as the memos had promised. The sound altered the field, and someone dropped a container of saline, which sloshed across the floor with a wet slap. The monitor shuddered. People in the room began to speak in urgent low tones. At the 29th minute, the subject registered a pattern that matched one of the memos. The case light stabilized into a shade I can only describe as wrong, and a man named Captain Ron Whitaker, who had helped move the case into the room, said in a voice small and stripped of bravado, "We need to shut it down." The decision to cut life support was not unanimous. Marcus argued, May argued that more time would yield answers. And Victor's face folded into the expression of someone who did not want to watch what might happen next. The argument had the tautness of a rope, and the exchanges between them numbered like a court transcript. We can learn. We can also hurt ourselves. The public cannot know. Keeping the secret is a crime against knowledge. If this breaks containment, it will be worse. We have protocols. Protocols failed. Then we document and we release. We will be imprisoned. Who runs the press? Who do we trust? We trust the ledger. By the 14th exchange, a hand moved toward a switch, and someone turned it. The sound that came as the machine powered down was like a long breath exhaled by a building. The subject's eyes closed, and the room tasted of ozone. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Marcus said with a voice small as a slipper, "We did what they asked." The fall had consequences immediate and profound. Word, as it always does, leaked in the form of rumors, and rumors became a web of conflicting reports. Some people were reassigned. A laboratory wing was sealed. Certain funding lines were redirected to cover a new project with a plausible name. Captain Ron Whitaker found his badge revoked, and his voice estranged in public when he tried to explain. Lena Ortiz retired early and moved to a house with drapes that never opened completely. Thomas Keller at the Municipal Archive found his index cards misfiled and his security clearance questioned. Anita Reyes's name appeared in a brief internal memo with the phrase temporary reassignment. Sarah Klein, who had been a public relations officer, filed a report that read like a corporate apology and yet never used the words that might have made the story true. The immediate aftermath smelled of burned coffee and the metallic tang of stress. The community of people who had been involved tightened like a fist and then dispersed. They called it containment and cleanup. To the outside world, it was nothing but a maintenance schedule. To those of us who had seen the photograph and heard the tape, it was a moral fissure that could not be smoothed. The tape at the center of this story became, for me, an ethic to test. Do I tell? Do I keep? Would revelation help or harm those who might be entangled with whatever Eva James had been? 1 month later, the first epilogue begins with a subtle rearrangement of the facts in public space and an undercurrent of rumor that spreads across forums and private message boards where enthusiasts pick at the edges of the official line. People like Victor disappear into longer hours at work. Victor's coffee mug sits half full in an anonymous kitchen, and the recordings circulate in fragments. There is an effect in the short term where family members of those involved are questioned, and where journalists reach out asking the sort of tentative questions that would not have been asked in months prior. I received an anonymous email that contained a single sentence: "Stop looking." I felt a muscle in my neck tighten, and the air tasted like copper. 1 month after the shutdown, a small local laboratory closed its doors, citing restructuring. No public statement linked the closure to the storage facility where Eva had been kept. The tone in public communications was dry and institutional. 3 months in, the pattern widens. By the 3rd month, leaked documents begin to appear that suggest an attempt to rewrite ledger entries and to reclassify catalog tags. Histories are redacted and refiled. A secondary set of documents surfaced that were unsigned and stamped with a date that mismatched official releases. At that point, a researcher named Sarah Klein, who had become uneasy with the edits, sent me a short note in a handwritten envelope with the smell of her perfume and ink that had bled a little from exposure to humidity. She wrote, "If you publish, do it cleanly. If you bury it with the facts." Her note made me understand that people on both sides were uncertain about what victory looked like. The 3rd month also brought me a meeting with an old colleague of Marcus named Eugene Black, who worked in information security. He told me stories of servers wiped at specific times and of phone lines that rang and then went silent. The taste of fear persisted, and my apartment seemed to hum with the electricity of surveillance. 6 months later, the epilogue reaches a strange kind of equilibrium. The public story has settled into a version of events that is tidy and unremarkable. A few positions were terminated, and a new oversight committee was named. In private, there are still people like Lena Ortiz and May Sun who live with regret, with the scent of their decisions like a perfume they cannot leave behind. I have kept duplicates of the cassette, stored in locks that smell faintly of solvent and paper, and I have copied transcripts into notebooks with spines that creak. The story left me changed. It left my nights longer and the edges of my sleep frayed. I began to hear hums in the dim hours and to feel small twitches behind my eyes when I passed certain lights. In the months that followed, I received phone calls at 2 in the morning with no voice on the other end and emails that contained only a string of numbers. I found myself dividing the world into those who would bury and those who would reveal. The moral choice imposed itself like a ledger entry. In private, the individuals connected to the case made choices that altered careers and families. Some found quiet lives and never spoke of it. Others withdrew into small towns where the scent of the ocean or the pines could ever memory. A handful of the people I interviewed continued to exchange letters and scraps of data. Their names moved stealthily through the margins of science. The institutional response was to tighten language and to declare certain archives closed for renovation. The closure language smelled like legal ink, and the air tasted of antiseptic and finality. There is no neat conclusion to what it means to have held an item like Eva James in a case and to have to decide whether to learn from it or to leave it sleeping forever. I am aware that by telling this story, I risk recreating an exposure that institutions wanted to avoid. I am aware that the tape will circulate and that someone will listen and do something reckless. I am also aware that secrecy can become a slow poison. If this investigation has moved you, tell me in the comments whether you would have shut the case or tried to open it further. Begin your comment with, "I think." Your perspective matters because it shapes how we approach future releases and which ethical lines we draw. If you value careful investigation and documented sources, subscribe to follow this thread as I will publish documents and reference material in a companion post after proper redaction. After the last arguments and the last switch turned off, certain names drifted from public scrutiny into private life with scars. Marcus Hale moved to a small town and learned to fix radios for neighbors. Lena Ortiz took up ceramics. Thomas Keller tended to his garden. Anita Reyes volunteered at a shelter. Victor Dumont took a teaching post at a technical school. Captain Ron Whitaker worked occasional cargo runs and kept his mouth closed. Dr. May Sun retired to a coastal town and wrote a small unpublished memoir where she recounts the hum of the case as a lullaby gone wrong. They all carry a residue of what we did, and that residue smells of burnt coffee and the oil of sealed crates. The moral question persists. When the unknown appears in our hands, do we preserve it for science or for safety? When does the pursuit of knowledge become the theft of peace from those who might suffer if boundaries expand? The tape left me with answers that were partial and with a single face I can see in my dreams, a pale profile in a sealed observation port. In the end, there was an institutional rearrangement that kept most of the public story plausible and tidy. A few small laboratories were closed and their funds reallocated to robust-sounding projects. The ledger was altered and then closed, as if editing a book to hide a scar. People moved on, as much as people ever move on from knowing that their choices could change lives. For my part, I keep the photographs in memory and the cassette in 2 places, and I keep writing down the rules because rules are what guide people must act. When institutions will not. This is not the end of the matter. There are other cassettes, other boxes, and other names left in marginalia across archives. There will be other meetings in diners and bars, and there will be other moments when people must decide whether to obey protocol or to defy it. If this narrative touched something in you and you want to be part of the next phase of inquiry, subscribe and follow the companion documents I will release after proper sourcing and redaction. I do not claim to have solved the ethics of keeping secrets between institutions and the human heart, but I can say this with some certainty. Whatever Eva James was, it forced people who trusted science to ask whether curiosity is itself a crime. The universe is not always polite in the questions it forces upon us, and sometimes our answers cost us more than we expect. If you have an artifact, a tape, or a memory that feels like it should be part of a public archive and yet is dangerous, think long and then speak responsibly. The story is not over because we keep finding small footprints in the dust where there should be none. The last line I will leave you with is this. They cataloged her to make her legible, and in doing so, they made the question of whether to read her a moral test. If this moved you, if it made your throat tight or your mind restless, please comment below and begin your reply with, "I think," so we can gather perspectives that will guide what we do next. And if you want to stay with this investigation and see documents and unredacted notes appear in a methodical way, subscribe and follow. We will continue to look for boxes that have been mislabeled and for names that do not belong in quiet ledgers. The cassette still sits under a lamp in my apartment, and when the room goes quiet at night, I sometimes play the piece of tape that holds the first voice and listen to the small, trembling breaths between words. It reminds me that there are truths sealed in cases, and that sometimes the only way to honor a life is to tell the story of how it was handled, even when telling that story is costly. The tape said at one point, and I quote from memory, "We fixed her more to question what we were than to help her." That sentence sits with me like a stone I cannot move. The investigation continues, and for now, the facts I can publish are here. The rest I keep as instruments for future work, because secrecy is heavy, and truth is heavier. If you want to help sort documents or to suggest the next line of inquiry, contact the channel and share sources. We will proceed with caution and with the humility that those who have handled unknown things learn by necessity. The world may prefer neat narratives, but what I found is messy, human, and stubbornly unresolved. I will be back with more documents and interviews and with a diary of each FOIA request and every crack in the ledger. Until then, remember that a photograph can be a crime and a cassette can be a confession, and that sometimes the only evidence that remains is the voice of someone who cannot be found in any official roster. The choice to share that voice changes the shape of public memory, and it changes the lives of the people who touched that case. This is my ledger of what I found regarding Eva James and Apollo 20 as best as I can assemble it now, and I will continue to call names and follow boxes until the archive yields more or until someone else does it before me.